There was no menu. There was a scale, a knife, and a man who had been standing over the same pit since 4 in the morning. You didn't order barbecue in Texas in 1910. You bought it by the pound because it was Saturday and the meat had to move before it spoiled. Nobody called it a delicacy. Nobody called it a tradition. It was survival wearing the smell of post-oak smoke. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Everything you now pay $40 a pound for started as a butcher's way of not losing money on Monday, number 25. Brisket, nobody wanted this cut. It was tough. It was full of connective tissue, and in the Lockhart meat markets of the early 1900s, it was the piece left over after the good cuts sold. Butchers rubbed it with nothing but salt and coarse black pepper, no marinade, no sauce, no apology, and let post-oak coals work on it for 12 hours or more. The bark that formed wasn't seasoning. It was proof the meat hadn't spoiled, laid bare in black and red for the customer to see. This was not a delicacy. This was what was left, number 24. Elgin Hot Guts, Elgin, Texas, 1882. A butcher named William Moon started selling meat off a horse-drawn wagon. And when Saturday's leftovers didn't sell, he ground the scraps, stuffed them by hand into natural hog casing, and hung them over the coals. They called it hot guts because that's exactly what it was. The parts nobody wanted, packed tight and smoked into something a family could stretch across 3 suppers. Coarse, peppery, snapping when you bit through the casing. Grandma just called it not letting good meat go in the trash, number 23. Cabrito, South Texas ranches, 1800s. A young goat, whole, split down the middle, staked over open mesquite coals until the skin blistered dark and the meat pulled loose with a fork. Vaqueros didn't have a smokehouse. They had a fire pit and a Sunday to fill. The goat cost almost nothing. It was the animal too small to sell at market weight. Today, a plate of cabrito shows up on a white tablecloth in Austin for $38, and the waiter calls it heritage cuisine. Number 22. Cracklins and chicharrones during the Depression, nothing from a hog went to waste. The skin, rendered slowly in its own fat, crackled and popped in the pan, crisp outside, tender underneath. Families in East Texas fried these in cast iron, salted them heavy, and ate them as the meal, not the snack. The kitchen filled with a hot, animal smell that meant supper. Nobody complained. The crackle meant the family would eat tonight without touching tomorrow's meat. Today they're bagged in plastic, sold for $6 at a gas station, and almost nobody knows a hog gave its skin for it. That isn't progress. That's a kitchen smell turned into a snack aisle. Number 21. Beef shoulder clod. This was the poor man's brisket, and in Lockhart butcher shops of the 1920s, it cost pennies less than brisket because it was tougher, stranger looking, harder to carve clean. Pitmasters treated it the same as the good cuts. Salt, pepper, smoke, patience, because a family didn't care what the cut was called. They cared whether it fed everyone at the table. That is not progress. Watching that same cut resurface on a steakhouse menu relabeled flat iron and priced like it was never anyone's leftovers. Number 20. Barbacoa de Cabeza, the Rio Grande Valley. Mexican-American ranch hands took the part of the cow that Anglo cattle owners threw away, the head, brains, cheek, tongue, and all, and turned it into the most labor-intensive barbecue in the entire state. The head, wrapped in Maggie leaves or burlap, went into a hole dug in the ground, 4 feet deep, buried under mesquite coals and a layer of packed earth, and left to cook overnight while a family slept above it, unable to see the fire but knowing exactly what it was doing. What came up in the morning fell apart at the touch of a fork, rich and gelatinous in a way no cut of brisket has ever managed, the cheek meat soft as custard, the tongue peeling clean. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Health departments across South Texas have spent the last 20 years tightening codes around open earth pits, citing sanitation the same way San Antonio once did to the chili stands, and the handful of families still cooking barbacoa this way are doing it under grandfather clauses that could end with the next inspection. Number 19. Mutton German settlers in the Texas Hill Country raised sheep for wool first, meat second, and when a sheep got too old to shear, it went in the smoke pit instead of the trash. This was mutton, not lamb, and there's a real difference. Older, tougher, stronger flavored meat that demanded hours of low heat before it gave up and went tender, the fat rendering slow and heavy until the whole pit smelled sharper than a brisket ever did. A cook had to know what she was doing to make mutton worth eating. Too little time and it fought back against the knife, too much and it fell apart into something with no character left. By the 1950s, beef had gotten cheap enough that mutton started disappearing from Central Texas pits, and the word itself became something people said with a curled lip, a synonym for poor, for old, for something you served when you had nothing better. Grandma just called it Sunday dinner, the only meat the family had, cooked with a skill nobody thought to write down. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 18. Pinto beans in drippings. Nobody wrote this recipe down because nobody thought it was a recipe. You put a pan of dried pinto beans directly under the meat on the pit, and for hours, every drop of fat and juice that fell off the brisket landed in that pan instead of the fire, sizzling faintly against the metal each time. By the time the meat came off, the beans had gone dark and glossy, absorbed a whole animal's worth of flavor. Nobody paid extra for, and nobody thanked anybody for either. This was not a side dish. This was the smokehouse refusing to waste a single drop of what the fire had already earned, turning drippings that would have hit ash into the second half of supper. Modern barbecue joints sell smoked beans as a premium upcharge now, cooked separately in a steam kettle, seasoned from a bottle of liquid smoke, missing the one thing that made them worth eating in the first place, the actual animal that was supposed to be cooking above them. Number 17. Head cheese German and Czech butchers in Central Texas boiled down a hog's head, meat, skin, connective tissue, and all, until it fell off the bone in the pot, the whole kitchen thick with a smell that was not unpleasant so much as unfamiliar to anyone who hadn't grown up around it. They packed it into a mold where the natural gelatin set overnight into a firm, sliceable loaf studded with meat, cool and dense, cut into pieces at the counter the next morning. It wasn't cheese at all. It was a butcher refusing to let an entire animal's head go to waste because nothing on that hog had a price tag low enough to throw away, not the ears, not the jowl, not the cheek. Sliced thin and eaten cold on bread with a little mustard. It disappeared from most smokehouse counters by the 1970s, the same decade Americans started deciding certain cuts were too honest to look at, too obviously an animal to keep on a shelf. Nobody replaced it with anything as thrifty. They just replaced it with waste, quietly, without ever admitting that's what happened to an entire generation of German and Czech thrift in one deli case. Number 16. Butcher paper and knife-only service walk into one of the old Lockhart meat markets today, and you still won't find a plate. The meat comes out on pink butcher paper, torn straight off the roll, damp and warm from the smoke still clinging to it, and you eat it standing at a long communal table with a knife, because that's exactly how it was done 100 years ago when this was a butcher shop first, and a restaurant only by accident. Cash only, most places, because a register and a card machine were never part of the plan. No forks. No dishes to wash at the end of a 16-hour day already spent tending a fire. No pretense, no server explaining the cut, no wine pairing suggested at the counter. This was not a lack of hospitality. This was hospitality stripped down to the only thing that ever mattered in that room, the meat, and whether it was good enough to speak for itself. A stranger walking in for the first time could tell in 30 seconds whether the place had anything worth eating. because there was nowhere for a bad brisket to hide behind a fork or a garnish. That is not a gimmick a modern restaurant can bolt on later. That is 100 years of a butcher having nothing to sell but the truth of his own smoke. Number 15. Post oak, smoke post oak burns slow, clean, and even. That's why Central Texas meat markets built their whole reputation on it. Mesquite, the wood everyone associates with Texas barbecue today, was the wood you used if your land couldn't grow anything better. It burns hotter, angrier, and it can turn meat bitter if a pitmaster doesn't know what he's doing. They knew things about wood that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Now, mesquite gets marketed as the premium option, and post oak barely gets mentioned on the label, number 14. White bread, pickles, and onions. Every Central Texas meat market served the same three things alongside the meat, and none of them were an accident. Soft white bread, cheap and plain, to soak up the drippings and stretch the meal further so a pound of brisket could feed a hand more than it should have been able to. Pickles for acid, sharp and cold against the tongue, to cut through fat that would otherwise sit heavy in a working man's stomach through a whole afternoon back in the field. Raw onion, sliced thick and free, because onions grew easy in that soil and cost the market almost nothing to keep on hand. Nobody plated these three things carefully. They sat in a pile at the edge of the paper waiting. This was not a garnish plate, not a chef's accompaniment chosen for color. This was arithmetic, plain and unsentimental. How to make a pound of smoked meat feed more people than the pound should have been able to feed. Every meat market in Central Texas landed on the same three answers independently, without a cookbook, without a food magazine telling them what belonged on the side. That is not coincidence. That is what happens when hunger teaches the same lesson to every family at once. Number 13. Chuckwagon Trail brisket cattle drives in the 1860s through the 1880s moved cows that were mostly muscle and gristle, worked hard for months walking the Chisholm Trail from Texas up into Kansas. The brisket off one of those animals was nearly inedible cooked fast, tough enough to work a man's jaw for an hour and still leave him hungry. So the trail cook dug a pit at the edge of camp, buried the brisket in coals overnight while the crew slept under open sky, and by morning, hours before the herd moved again, it had broken down into something a tired cowboy could actually chew standing up, plate in hand, no time to sit. This was the earliest version of the low and slow method that Texas barbecue would later build an entire identity around, market it, franchise it, born not from craft or ambition, but from a cook with no other choice and cattle too valuable and too tough to waste on a fast fire. Nobody on that trail called it barbecue. They called it not going hungry on a horse for the next 10 hours. Number 12. Blood sausage German and Czech immigrant butchers made morsilla using every part of the hog slaughter, including the blood itself, mixed with rendered fat, spices, and sometimes rice or grain, then packed into casing and smoked slow until it turned dark and dense, almost black at the edges. Nothing about a hog killing went unused when a family had spent the whole year raising that one animal. It was one of the first traditions to vanish from Texas meat markets, disappearing faster than almost any other item on this list as it got labeled foreign and unappetizing by a generation eager to seem more American than their own grandparents, eager to put distance between themselves and an accent, a recipe, a slaughter day. They knew things about using an entire animal, about wasting nothing a family had raised and fed and killed that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. This was not a strange dish. This was the last honest use of an animal before an entire generation decided honesty about food was something to be embarrassed of at the dinner table. Number 11. Venison jerky on the Texas frontier. Before refrigeration existed anywhere in the state, deer meat that couldn't be eaten immediately was sliced thin against the grain, rubbed heavy with salt, and hung on lines strung between trees or wagon rails to dry in the sun and wind until it would keep for months without spoiling. It turned dark and leathery, tough enough to chew for a long stretch, which was the point. A piece could last a man through a whole day's ride. This was not a snack food, not something reached for out of boredom. This was the only way a family survived the stretch of winter between one successful hunt and the next, when there was no store, no icebox, nothing standing between them and an empty pot. Modern beef jerky sold in gas station racks bears almost no resemblance to it. Mass-produced, sugar-cured, shelf-stable by chemistry and preservatives, instead of by salt, wind, and a family's patience. That is not progress. That is a survival technique reduced to a snack rack impulse buy at a checkout counter. Number 10. Kolache at the meat market check immigrant communities in Central Texas didn't separate the butcher shop from the bakery. The same families running the meat markets were often up before dawn baking kolache too, a soft yeasted pastry filled with fruit or sweet cheese, or with sausage for the men headed straight to the fields, sold right alongside the smoked meat on Saturday mornings out of the same front counter. This was not a dessert stop after barbecue, a separate errand for a separate craving. This was one economy, one family, refusing to specialize when specializing meant turning away income a household actually needed to survive the week. The sausage-filled version, klobasnek, has survived mostly by accident, sold now at gas stations under the Kolache name, wrapped in plastic, baked off-site somewhere far from Central Texas, with almost none of the original bakery, or the family standing behind that counter, attached to it anymore. That is not progress. That is a whole immigrant economy shrunk down to a single pastry shape on a rotating warmer. Number 9. Smoked beef tongue, smoked low and slow for hours until the tough outer layer could be peeled back like a glove. Beef tongue was common on Central Texas and South Texas pits well into the mid-1900s, sliced thin against the grain and rich with a texture closer to brisket than most people expect the first time they try it. A good pitmaster knew the moment the skin gave way easily under a thumbnail, which meant hours more of patient, low heat before it was ready to slice for the counter. It disappeared from menus as America decided offal was something to be embarrassed about, something to hide from a menu printed for outsiders, even though tongue carries more iron and B vitamins per ounce than most of the cuts that quietly replaced it. Grandma just called it not wasting the best part of the animal, not the strangest part, the best part. She was right. Everything she knew was right, decades before a nutrition label ever caught up to confirm it. Number 8. German potato salad and vinegar slaw before mayonnaise became the default in American kitchens. German settlers in the hill country dressed their potato salad and cabbage slaw in hot bacon fat poured straight from the pan in sharp vinegar, tangy instead of sweet, thin instead of creamy, glossy on the potatoes instead of coated white. It was built on purpose to sit outside on a long table through a hot Texas afternoon without spoiling, sitting for hours in the sun beside the smoked meat, because there was no refrigerator waiting to save it if it went bad, and no second chance if a family got sick off it. Vinegar and hot fat were preservation as much as they were flavor. That is not progress. Watching sugar and industrial mayonnaise quietly replace a dressing that was engineered out of necessity to survive a heat that modern potato salad has never once had to survive. Nobody in the hill country called it a recipe. They called it common sense, and common sense doesn't get a byline. Number 7. Smoked turkey legs at rural Texas fairs and community gatherings through the 1940s and 1950s. Whole turkeys, often raised in the family's own yard, fed scraps all summer for exactly this purpose, went into the same pits as the beef and pork, smoked low for hours until the meat pulled clean off the bone and the skin turned dark and lacquered from the smoke. It was a once or twice a year event. not a routine meal tied to harvest time or a celebration big enough to justify killing a bird a family had raised by hand and fed all season. Neighbors brought their own turkeys to the same communal pit, trading fire and labor the way they'd trade tools. Today, the smoked turkey leg survives mostly as a theme park novelty, sold wrapped in foil to a stranger walking past a stand, detached from any of the community, the raising, or the fire that used to surround it. That is not progress. That is a family gathering flattened into a photo opportunity. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Every one of those forgotten cuts, the tongue, the cheek, the head, the drippings soaked into a pan of beans, carried something modern nutrition science is only now circling back to confirm. Slow, low heat over many hours breaks down the collagen in connective tissue and converts it into gelatin. The same compound doctors now recommend for joint and gut health in expensive powdered supplements. The awful cuts these families were forced to use carried more iron, more B12, more collagen than the lean, trimmed cuts that eventually replaced them on the American plate. They knew things about nutrition that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember, and they knew it because they had no choice but to use the whole animal. That is not progress. That is a nutritional inheritance thrown in the trash so a cleaner-looking cut could sell for more per pound. Number 6. Pan de Campo Cowboy camp bread, cooked in a cast-iron skillet, set at the edge of the coals rather than directly over the fire, where the heat came slow, and even instead of scorching the bottom before the middle, had a chance to cook through. Made from nothing but flour, lard, baking powder, and water. No eggs, no milk, nothing a chuck wagon might run out of halfway through a drive. It rose flat and dense, more substantial than a biscuit, built to travel in a saddlebag wrapped in cloth and survive a full day on horseback without crumbling apart in a man's pocket. This was not bread for the table. Not something served warm with butter in a dining room. This was bread built for a man who might not see a table or a roof again for a week. Grandma just called it what you make when the wagon is all the kitchen you have. Number 5. Chili Queen's Plaza Chilean, the plazas of San Antonio from the 1880s through the 1930s, Mexican-American women known as the Chili Queens ran open-air stands after dark, lanterns lit along the square, cooking beef and dried red chile in open pots with no beans, no tomato, nothing but meat, fire, and heat that built slowly in the back of a diner's throat. Travelers wrote about them in every guidebook of the era, called them one of the great sights of the city, a nighttime ritual worth crossing Texas to see. And then city health ordinances in the 1930s and 1940s shut the plaza stands down one by one, citing sanitation concerns that never seemed to apply the same way to indoor restaurants owned by someone else, while the recipe itself got absorbed into those same restaurant menus with almost no credit given to the women who built the entire tradition from a lantern and a pot. This was not a food trend that faded on its own. This was an entire economy of women feeding a city, legislated out of existence. Number 4. Chorizo fresh, not smoked. Chorizo came out of Tejano and Mexican immigrant kitchens using vinegar-cured pork trimmings, heavy with dried chile and spice, ground and packed by hand, meant to be cooked fast in a pan rather than slow over coals the way everything else on this list was. It sat at the edge of what most people call barbecue, standing apart from the pit entirely, but it belonged to the exact same tradition of using every scrap of the hog and wasting nothing a family couldn't afford to lose. The trim, the fat, the pieces too small to sell as a cut. The vinegar did double work, curing the meat and cutting the richness of all that fat at once. Today's supermarket chorizo is often a soy filler product manufactured in bulk, bearing the name on the package with almost none of the original vinegar-forward character, or the hands that used to grind it intact. That is not progress. That is a name kept and a recipe quietly discarded. Number 3. Ash-baked sweet potato. During the Depression, families with a pit fire already going for meat would bury sweet potatoes directly in the embers at the edge of the coals, tucked in where the heat ran gentler than the center of the fire, and let them roast slowly in the ash for over an hour until the skin blackened, cracked, and the inside turned soft, dark, and caramelized around the edges where the sugars had started to burn. There was no oven involved, no separate fuel spent, no extra minute of anyone's labor beyond digging it out with a stick when it was ready. It cost nothing beyond the potato itself and the fire that was already burning for something else entirely. This was not a side dish planned in advance on a menu. This was a family stretching one fire, one bed of coals, to cook 2 meals at once because there wasn't fuel to spare for a second. Grandma just called it not letting a good fire go to waste while it burned. Number 2. Juneteenth Earth Pit Barbecue, June 19th, 1865, Galveston, Texas. The day enslaved people in Texas learned they were free. 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation had already been signed elsewhere, and simply never reached them. The celebration that followed centered on barbecue, cooked in earth-dug pits using techniques carried directly from West African and Southern cooking traditions, whole animals lowered into the ground the way generations before had done it under forced labor, now done for the first time by choice. Barbecue had become, for newly freed families, a food that meant survival, and on that day, for the first time, it also meant freedom in the exact same bite over the exact same fire. Of the barbecue tradition's most credited names and halls of fame, black pitmasters remain among the least recognized today. Honored mostly after death, footnoted in a cuisine their ancestors built the earliest version of with their own hands and their own fire. That is not progress. That is 160 years of the same theft, still happening in real time. Number 1. Menudo beef tripe, cleaned and simmered for hours with hominy and dried red chile until the tough stomach lining turned tender and rich, the broth going deep red and thick. Menudo was Sunday morning in households across Texas. A dish built entirely from the part of the cow that had almost no resale value on its own, the part a market couldn't move at any price. It brought a family to the table the exact same way brisket did on Saturday, feeding everyone off one animal, using the opposite end of the cow to do it. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. The same cow that gave up the $40 brisket, everyone now lines up for at 7 in the morning, gave up the tripe for Menudo 2 on the exact same slaughter day. And one of those cuts still gets served proudly in a bowl nobody's ashamed of, sold with pride on a Sunday menu. The other one got erased from the story entirely, treated like something to apologize for instead of the same animal, the same sacrifice, the same family fed. Closing, they buried a cow's head in the ground and pulled out something better than anything a restaurant kitchen makes today. They stood at a counter with a knife and butcher paper and called it dinner. They lit a fire on the day they became free and turned it into the oldest barbecue tradition this state has. That was not poverty. That was mastery, forged by people who had every reason to give up on flavor and refused. The food industry took that mastery, stripped the names off it, franchised the recipe, and sold it back at a markup nobody's grandmother would have recognized. That is not progress. That is theft with good lighting and a menu design budget. Grandma just called it Sunday dinner. She was right. Everything she knew was right, and it's still sitting in your family's memory, waiting for someone to light the fire again. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made.